I gotta move over to my Detroit Tigers.
The biggest news of the trade deadline.
Yeah,
The trade that never happened.
yeah, that the irony is they were the talk of the trade deadline, yet they didn't make the trade of the deadline. That seemed to be right there, and the confusion on what the fuck happened there. I think that's going to lead to an older segment of ours, some hardball deep throat investigative journalism to figure out how the hell this trade didn't happen. Uh, I gotta just some history here. I got into Twitter, which I guess we have to call X now. Actually, I have to
Yeah,
change our
what
I have to
the?
change our little symbols here. I've got the Twitter logo for our Twitter
Will you
handles
get
here.
on that for Christ's sake?
Got to switch that
Jesus.
to X. I think I'm never calling it X, even though I just did three
I know
times. But
it's Twitter as
it'll be
far as
Twitter probably in like 3 months. I'll switch back, and it's all a ruse. But I got into Twitter strictly because of the trade deadline about probably 12 years ago, 10 years ago, because it is the perfect way to follow what the fuck's going on. You get real news in real time from real journalists. I had no interest in Twitter before that, but I had to know what was happening with my Tigers and Cubs. And
think of all the joy it's brought us with Bob's bad tweets. I
oh,
mean,
that yeah, he's been okay with trade deadline stuff. It's he gets deep in the weeds during the season, but I haven't noticed him being completely off on
well,
trade deadline accuracy. But
he did though say that Lance Lynn was a done deal to the Rays. So
that's right, I forgot about that.
so anyway,
But yeah, Jeff Passan is somebody I trust implicitly, even though he's doing this from the injured
yes,
list. He's got a
yes.
broken back right now, but he's still breaking
Ugh.
stories. Buster Olney's another one. There's plenty that I follow. But I was furiously refreshing my Twitter throughout the afternoon on
I was doing the
deadline day.
same freaking thing on my phone.
I was wondering because you're on vacation, so I didn't know
Yeah,
if you were
but
gonna have
but
time
I,
or
I
what was
kept
going
I
on.
kept like looking.
Well, I was. It was a really interesting deadline day. There'd been significant moves throughout the weekend, which was cool, and it didn't all just like land on one day. But lots of things were happening. Of course, the story I kept hearing, and the only for the Tigers at least, what I was interested in is how the pitching market was going to finally loosen up. There hadn't been many pitchers traded, and of course the Tigers had Michael Lorenzen, who did get traded, which we'll talk about in a bit, and Eduardo Rodriguez, of course, who would have been the larger prize. But
The centerpiece.
yes, the whole idea that I kept reading was that Justin Verlander was essentially holding up the entire pitching market. Like once he moved someplace, that was going to open up everything for everybody else, and that proved to be true because I think it was, excuse me, maybe two o'clock. Verlander finally got traded to Houston, which makes perfect sense. And eventually Lorenzen got traded to the Phillies for their number 5 prospect, How Yu Lee, second base prospect. Sounds like kind of a utility guy, kind of a depth piece. I think he was their number 10 prospect, but he automatically becomes the Tigers' number 5 prospect, which is kind of surprising. Or maybe I got that backwards, but so not a bad return for Lorenzen since he was certainly a rental. I thought he was, kind of outperforming what he would be eventually. I'll be proven wrong.
Whoops.
I was proven
Whoops.
wrong by that, which we'll get to shortly. Unbelievable, but I thought they sold high on him, and I thought it was really nice. It worked out perfectly. He was as good as he's ever been in his career at the trade deadline, so I didn't have a problem with what they got. I think I'd add more to that after the events of last evening if we could, um, but the real story was what I was waiting for and furiously refreshing Twitter for was Eduardo Rodriguez news. And about an hour before the deadline, I see a tweet from Jeff Passan, and it said, I just started reading it. It said LA Dodgers and Detroit Tigers. And I almost started to hit the like button before I even read the next word. I was on the verge of. Unfortunately, the next words were deal scuttled after Eduardo Rodriguez exercises no trade clause. And immediately and myself and everyone in the fucking baseball world is like, what the fuck just happened? How how could he? How could they make a start working on a deal to, certainly the Dodgers are a reputable franchise. The Tigers with a brand new general manager, but has a pedigree that you would think he's an intelligent executive that knew what he was doing. How could they get this far into the deadline, negotiate a deal, and yet not have the player's permission, who has a no trade clause, not have his permission to actually pull off the deal? And it's just kind of it ended up being an unfortunate way that the tweet was phrased. It was true. There was nothing false about the phrase, but the way it came out, it was that Scott Harris was a buffoon. He tried to negotiate this whole deal and never got Eduardo's permission to waive his no trade clause. And that was the narrative throughout the evening on that. I believe it was Monday night. The only one that spoke about it was Scott Harris later that evening in his post trade deadline news conference. And unfortunately, he really couldn't say much about it. And with hindsight, you know why. He couldn't really get into details with all the questions being asked. No one understood how he could get this far uh, without having permission. And the way it actually turns out is, of course, he had spoken to Eduardo Rodriguez about his no trade clause. Of course, he had agreed to, in certain terms, to waive that if it went to the right team or in the right situation. And it's interesting because, of course, Eduardo had a deal signed with the Tigers by Alavila last year for a 5-year deal for $77 million. He negotiated an opt-out after the second year, which is this year, which is what's made Erod an obvious trade candidate for a team that's not going to the playoffs. But it also included a no trade clause. I knew that. Everybody knew that. There's no way Scott Harris didn't know that. So, but it was just very confusing and frustrating at the time that 1 hour before the trade deadline, you hear the star trade commodity is not moved just because he didn't exercise, or he did exercise his no trade clause. So that was Monday night. The Tuesday after, Eduardo Rodriguez actually happened to be a starting pitcher for the Detroit Tigers. I thought he'd be a starting pitcher potentially for the LA Dodgers, but that was not the case. But they announced he would be speaking to the media after his game. And I went into the game. He's actually on my fantasy team, which I was thinking about dumping him because I was sure after everything that happened the previous day, he would be a basket case and just have a terrible performance. And he was lights out. I think he ended up giving up 2 runs over 6 or 7. He was as good as he had been previously in the best parts of his season so far. So I was kind of surprised by that and happy about that. I mean, because it worked for my Tigers and my fantasy team. But I was really, really watching that game just to get through the game so we could get to the goddamn interview where he actually explains what the fuck happened. And because he's the one that holds all the cards. He
Right.
knew what was going on. It's not up to the Tigers to explain it. It's not up to the Dodgers to explain it. It was up to him. The reason Scott, I was assuming later in the evening, the first night, is that he couldn't talk about things because he didn't want to throw his player under the bus. He didn't want to throw the Dodgers under the bus in case they, did something weird that he wasn't ready for or he wasn't happy about or something. He just didn't know at that point. But finally, Erod is interviewed after the game, and it was cool that he stood up there and answered all the questions. I wasn't sure that he would. Unfortunately, didn't really answer them in a genuine way. I didn't think. I thought he was disingenuous, in fact. When he was asked about what happened with the deal with the Dodgers, he just said, "I don't control anything that happens outside the lines," meaning he only has control over what happens on the field in his pitching, and that's literally false. I mean, he's the one who has the no trade clause. He's the one that has the opt out. So he holds all the cards. So he controls everything that happened outside the lines in this. So I thought that was a really weak explanation. Some players can get away with that don't have no trade clauses or opt out clauses that they control, but they leave, they don't have control over that, so they leave everything up to their agent and figure things out. That was certainly not the case. The other disingenuous thing he said is they asked him if he was going to opt into his contract after the season to stay with the Tigers, which is of supreme interest right now because the Tigers just lost the chance to trade away a piece at this deadline that could have brought back very, very interesting returns from one of the strongest farm systems in all of baseball, and which we'll never know what could have been. So we're all trying to figure out if at least we could hold on to him and maybe get something of value out of this contract. His response is that he did not have a magic ball or a crystal ball to tell the future if he was going to stay or not. It's like, dude, you have the opt out. You can choose to stay. Like, so he's acting like he's powerless over all the events that transpired, and it makes me really frustrated. Like how he thinks he can just say those things, and we're gonna believe that. So it makes me not trust him. And beyond that, I need to get into history here. In a part that I missed, another narrative that was flying around, besides blaming Scott Harris before more things came to light, is people were starting to blame Eduardo Rodriguez's wife. I believe her name is Catherine, and she's a public figure of sorts. She's a Instagram influencer, I think.
Oh, really?
But she also is part of the news in ways because of an incident that you may recall from last season, where
Yes.
Eduardo Rodriguez had to leave the team for a total of almost 2 months. Within the first year of his 5-year deal, he had left the team. At first, it was a ridiculously confusing story. He essentially went AWOL. It wasn't reported for quite a while that the Tigers even knew where he was. I believe it was a week or maybe even 2 weeks before there were reports saying that we are finally in communication with Eduardo. We know he's okay, at least, that was a legitimate question at that time. Was he abducted? Like, what the fuck happened? It turns out he was dealing with some marital issues, which is understandable. I mean, we've seen it with Ben Zobrist. He had similar crazy issues with his wife at the end of his Cubs career, where he had to take time off, but nobody knew what was going on for a while, and essentially, it helped torpedo one of many things that helped torpedo the Tigers 2022 season is we had no access to Eduardo Rodriguez for 2 months. So she was a known commodity in that we knew there were some marital issues. So people surmised from that information from last year, and then the strange turn of events at this trade deadline that, well, Scott Harris got Eduardo's permission previously to negotiating with the Dodgers to waive the no trade clause, but they didn't get his wife's permission. And she nixed the deal because she didn't want to go to Los Angeles. She wanted to stay on the East Coast or closer to the East Coast at least. That was reckless speculation. I actually saw some regular journalists throw that out there, so it actually gained traction over the night, but with plausible reasons. I mean, we've seen there are issues that have affected the Tigers directly with his marriage. So it doesn't seem fair, but it is in this case. So what really happened though, and what took this is where we get to the hardball deep throat, the investigative journalist. It was not me. I'm not going to take credit for this, but of course it was the most trustworthy of all baseball journalists. Ken Rosenthal finally on Wednesday dug up the fact that Eduardo Rodriguez and his agent, I forgot his name, George Mateo, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
were demanding the Dodgers give him an extra year and $20 million onto his deal.
It's unbelievable when I read that. I was just like, what the fuck?
Previous to that revelation, his agent, Mateo or whoever it is, released a statement, defending Eduardo, but saying they were working on a deal, but they simply ran out of time. And it's like, that is not an excuse that any agent can use in this situation. That is admitting incompetence if it was a time issue that scuttled this deal. Mind you, if we're really literally talking about time, there was still 1 hour left in the trade deadline before that deal was, that deal was scuttled 1 hour before the actual deadline. So
Right.
there was time. There's ways to get things done. We've seen even the incompetent Al Avila make a deal with 3 seconds to go at the deadline for Justin Verlander to the Astros back in 2017, which didn't do very well for the Tigers, although we still have Jake Rogers from that.
And they just have to alert the office too.
Yeah, I don't know the protocol, if there has to be a fax sent out or how it works these days.
It used to be they used to fax in that in principle, blah 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 and blah blah blah.
I'm assuming that can be as easy as a text or a phone call or anything now. So,
but then the final paperwork can come in and we saw it this year actually a lot. There were deals announced hours after the trade deadline that things had gone through, but the paperwork hadn't been to MLB office yet to make it official. So
yeah, so clearly that's the other side of this. Eduardo's agent, I think, is being very disingenuous as well. But when it's revealed that, and no one's spoken about this other than the reporting that I can see from Ken Rosenthal, that he asked for the 1 extra year on his deal and the $20 million. So what that implies is that the Dodgers asked him to waive his opt-out in addition already to his no trade clause. So on the surface, I think that's fairly reasonable in a way for Eduardo to ask for something in return, because he's giving up not only his no trade clause, because he said he put the Dodgers right on his list, but he also is opting into the final 3 years, which he loses all his leverage in a way, or the opportunity to become a free agent again. So to ask for something back isn't necessarily out of bounds in my mind, at least. So I'm not going to hold him to the fire for that. The weirdness comes from the idea that a single year or a total of $20 million would completely wipe out this deal. I'm wondering how the Tigers couldn't have stepped in and say, let's make this work. We will cover 10 million of that $20 million. How the Dodgers decided, well, fuck this. We can't possibly afford another $20 million, which is actually below market value for a pitcher right now for a year.
Right.
That would be the end of his deal. So I'm still baffled by that part of it. Like, there, at least there's some clarity, and I think there's some definite. The blame is on Eduardo. It's not Scott Harris's incompetence. I can't believe it would be Andy Freeman's negligence or stubbornness that stopped this deal. There's still one piece missing that I'm not fully understanding. We may never know the final details for, but at least it brought some clarity. I think Ken Rosenthal is really who brought the clarity to it. I'm not sure if everyone followed all the details all the way through. That's why I wanted to chronicle everything in this probably annoying, exhaustive manner. I wanted to get all these thoughts out there to at least put most of it to rest in my mind, and hopefully anyone who gives a shit listen to this podcast, that this comes down to Eduardo. And really, since the weird shit that happened in his first year, his explanations and not really taking ownership of the situation this past week really makes me nervous about this guy's character. The thing is, he keeps shoving. He had another fantastic outing yesterday, so he's not letting it affect anything on anything of his performance on the field. He's going to work for the Tigers still, and he keeps saying he loves it in Detroit, and that was part of his explanation why he didn't waive his no trade clauses, because they love it in Detroit somehow, and he's very comfortable there. And we'll see. I mean, if he opts in, then he was not being disingenuous, and he was being forthright. But somehow I don't believe it. In the way he's kind of stepping around the issue, I'd be shocked if he's a Tiger next year, which means Tigers fans will always be thinking about those 4 or 5 prospects that could have come from the embarrassingly rich Dodgers system. I think your White Sox took advantage of that system in a couple of trades we'll talk about here, but I think you're pretty happy with what you got from those same Dodgers. So it'll always be tantalizing to Tigers fans what could have been. And I'm going to blame Erod for that not happening.
Do you think there's a narrative that went around after all this came out that Scott Harris was negligent in that he hadn't worked any sort of like backup deals, knowing that there was still some negotiating that needed to be worked out?
Yep. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's still a narrative. What I believe happened was Verlander was the Dodgers' number 1 option. That was their plan A. And when he went to Houston, plan B was already in place, and that was Eduardo Rodriguez. And they had everything worked out. He agreed to waive his no trade clause. I believe at the end, either the Dodgers demanded that he opt in to the final 3 years, or he had already agreed to that, but then he upped his demands and that he wanted another year and $20 million. So that's where it's confusing. To the idea that Scott Harris was negligent and didn't have a plan B, I would say you could argue the same thing in this situation for Andrew Friedman, that he didn't have a plan B either, because they didn't make another deal with an hour to go. So they were both completely caught off guard by it, and no one was prepared for it. So it's unfortunate that this is Scott Harris's first trade deadline, and that's why that narrative has legs, because he doesn't have a track record that suggests he knows what the fuck he's doing, where the Dodgers definitely do, and they were caught flat-footed as well. So that it could be that Harris fucked this up completely, but I tend to, I'm going to be an apologist for him until I know for a fact he's as incompetent as Al Avila was. But I don't think so, mainly because the Dodgers were caught just as flat-footed, and it was just a bizarre situation that no one's really figured out. But
that's a fair assessment that I'm surprised other people haven't really made, in the fact that if the team, the Dodgers knew more than probably Scott Harris at that point. I'm sure he was checking in on how things were transpiring.
Yeah, because
since they're the one working the deal, they would know that, okay, well, we got to make a decision on if we want to pay him this $20 million or not. And the fact that unless it came out so late in the deal, like,
again,
it's just so bizarre. We'll never know. We can
the hour left. The hour left drives me crazy.
Yeah. You're right, because that story broke with an hour left to the trade deadline, and everyone was like, "What the fuck?"
I'll never forget that moment.
And I also think that's why people think, "Well, what were you doing, Scott Harris? You still had an hour to work the phones." But he's not going to go on and say, well, I worked the phone for an hour and couldn't get a trade done. No one's going to tell you what really happened.
Yeah, and he may have done that. He also said he wasn't going to give them away for nothing, because now
that's the other thing. Like the next thing you'd want to do is only negotiate with the teams he would agree to go to, so you didn't run into this again. But maybe they didn't have what was good for the Tigers. So
I think and another explanation for that might be that it was obvious that Eduardo wasn't going to be reasonable or whatever, that there was no opportunity for his camp, did not want him to be traded at that point. So That's the only thing I can think of. And maybe I'm certainly not an insider. I'm playing the role of Woodward and Bernstein here. I'm not an investigative journalist, but I'm playing off of other people's work and trying to connect dots. That's the only thing I can think of how this would work. And it all just points back to Erod, not to incompetence of anyone's general manager, which we like to blame for it in a lot of levels on all of our teams over the years. So it's just not the case, I don't think, in this case. So.
Word Hole Media.